So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, and it's also someone I've known from my past, Paul Komesaroff, Professor of Medicine, practicing endocrinologist and physician. He's the Executive Director of an international non-government organisation called Global Reconciliation, and also Director of the Centre for Ethics in Medicine and Society at Monash University. And Paul was another of my teachers. He was my PhD supervisor back in 2003. So I've got both two of my favourite speakers and teachers here today. So Paul, over to you.
Now,
That should get it.
and I pointed it.
Press the bottom one, that's all.
Okay, so, well, Carly's told you a bit about me, so this is just who I am, so you know where I'm coming from. What else do I need to tell you? I'm President of Adult Medicine in the Royal Australasian College of Physicians. I do a lot of stuff in ethics, and I do a lot of stuff with NGOs. And I've mentioned a couple here. I'm also a member of the research committee of the National Institute of Complementary Medicines in Sydney. My talk is completely different from Rob's, but in a way complementary to it, in a way that I think could work quite well. We'll see how it goes. I work in the field of reconciliation, and I'm going to just tell you what reconciliation is, but then I'm going to apply it to foreign and humanitarian aid with a bit of a critique, and I'll just give you a bit of an indication about where I'm coming from and why this is complementary to what Rob has been talking about. Rob's been talking about the effects of big multinational, supranational corporations, and I see that as being pretty closely aligned with the regimes of foreign aid. And the need is actually to reverse the trend, and the work that I do is actually very much embedded in communities, and that's what the new approaches are that I'll tell you about. And if there's time, I'll give you a little bit of a picture essay about Gaza, which is one of the places that I work at the moment, which illustrates the kinds of things that we have to do. Now, Rob could give a talk about any one of the many places that he's worked in, including Malawi, but I think it's important to ground a talk of this sort in the actual lives of the people that we're talking about. So my thing's reconciliation, but I've got a special way of using this word. Reconciliation in our usage refers to the promotion of dialogue and communication across difference. So it's about bringing people who see the world or experience the world or know the world differently together in such a way that they can establish some process of dialogue or communication. The differences can be cultural, racial, religious, political, whatever. So it's a philosophical problem. I'm a philosopher by original training. The question is, how do you actually translate across different systems of meaning? And that's the problem, of course, with natural medicines, integrative medicine, complementary medicines, and so on. I've done a fair bit of work in China, but I'm a conventional physician. Within the mainstream of Western medicine. When I go to China and I talk to a Chinese practitioner who talks in the language of Chinese medicine, it's completely different, in a sense unintelligible to me. When I hear about yin and yang and kidney fire and whatever, they're not words that actually technically make any sense within the paradigm of knowledge within which I speak. On the other hand, I recognise that the people I'm communicating with are working within a system of knowledge that is internally coherent, that's based on thousands of years of observation, that's highly systematic, and delivers results. So here I am, not understanding the language in more ways than one, but recognising that there's the possibility of making sense. That's the problem of reconciliation. How do I understand across these great gulfs of meaning, of knowledge, of culture, of philosophy, and so on? And now the second point, though, about reconciliation is how do you actually do it? It's not just a purely cognitive thing. It's not a philosophical task. It's not just a matter of how you think. It's a matter of how you actually do things together. how do you actually build a common practice whereby you can start to understand what the other person is doing or where they're coming from? And the way in which we work practically is in relation to everyday practices. You take an everyday practice as a platform on which people can come together and share things. And that becomes the basis in which people can start to build relationships of trust and mutual understanding. They can actually build the possibility of understanding. Now, I'm going to talk at the end. I said I'll do a photo essay about Gaza. So I do a fair bit of work in the Middle East, in Israel and Palestine especially. And this is one of the most difficult and intractable places in the world to work, of course. But what you don't do is what countless diplomats, American presidents and so on have tried to do, which is to solve the problem theoretically. It's not just a matter of saying what's different, how can we negotiate in between. What we need to do is actually build some sort of common basis of experience and knowledge, of shared values. So you don't talk about who owns Jerusalem, because if you talk about who owns Jerusalem, no one will say something that hasn't been said many times in the last 2,000 years. And people will simply repeat what they say, they'll shout at each other and so on. On the other hand, if you talk about the impact of the conflict on the next generation, whether you're a Palestinian in Gaza or the West Bank, or whether you're an Israeli Jew in the streets of Tel Aviv, you'll know what we're talking about, and you'll have the same impulses and the same beliefs. So this is a basis on which people can come together with a shared sense of value in which they can start actually to do things together. They can build, as I was saying before, these relationships of trust and start to find ways of communicating with each other. The daily practices can be in healthcare, obviously that's my thing, but we also work in the arts, in sport, education, spirituality, environment, business and so on. Reconciliation's not conflict resolution. In conflict resolution, you identify the differences between people and try and overcome them. In reconciliation, you identify those differences and you respect, protect and treasure them as sources of new meaning and new possibility, so that you can actually come together and create something that's new and different. So now, in the second part of my talk, I'm going to switch to talking about international health care. And this is the basis of what a lot of us do. This is the basis, I think, of probably much of what Rob's done for many decades, to contribute to the health needs of people in other countries. There are lots of ways in which we in Australia can contribute. This might be too small for people at the back to read. Here are just a few examples. In the field of public health, we can assist in the development of public health programs, nutrition, immunisation programs, infection control, women's health, child health, diabetes, HIV/AIDS, and so on. We can assist in developing health administration systems, disaster planning, health management, information services, lots of other areas, developing primary healthcare facilities, health research, telemedicine, dental health and so on. I work in a number of different areas. One of the current areas that I'm working at the moment is Myanmar. Myanmar essentially is, in many places, certainly in remote areas, is like ground zero as far as healthcare is concerned. And that's largely because it was ruined by the junta that controlled the country for nearly 20 years. And whilst there are health facilities in some of the big cities, out in the countryside, often there's literally nothing. There are no doctors. There's not even the most basic elements of healthcare. And particularly in the monsoon season, many of these places are completely cut off from any access to the rest of the world. So there's a lot of work to be done in actually not just reconstructing, but constructing from the beginning health services within a lot of these countries. And we in Australia have lots of things that we can do to assist. We can assist by active contribution, we can. One of the traditional ways in which international healthcare has worked is that people have actually gone and delivered healthcare services. Surgeons have gone, and these are very well-meaning people who'll go and conduct operations. People will go as physicians, as primary care physicians, as gynecologists and so on. They're good people and they do good things, but in a way it's the worst way to develop a healthcare system, because what you need to do is actually to build the capacity in those countries. And actually beaming in, whether it's through the internet or by people coming in on aeroplanes or whatever, expertise often has the opposite effect to what you actually want to achieve. It may actually deplete the skill set within those kinds of countries. So the aim is to assist in the development of capacity by working with communities to allow them to identify what their agendas and their priorities may be. The cultural context is everything. The issues are the issues that have to be chosen by the local people. They're not the things they're not our agenda. It's not what we think are important, but what the people within those local communities feel are important. And we need to be able to work with them to build their capacity, to empower them to transform the contexts within which they live. Now, the third part of my talk is about foreign health aid. And I've got a slogan here that summarises everything, which is that most foreign aid is neither foreign nor aid. It's in most cases an arm of foreign policy. And this is the connection, in a sense, with Rob's talk. When the US State Department undertakes health assistance elsewhere in the world, or foreign aid in general, their interest is not primarily altruistic or humanitarian. Their interest is in furthering the benefits for local American. It's not the American people. I nearly said American people. That would be a terrible mistake. For the American capitalists, for the American business, for the American political class. In Australia, we used to have an organisation called AusAid, which was abolished, as you know, and folded into DFAT. Of course, that was a terrible thing to happen, and they've slashed Australia's contribution to foreign aid by nearly a half now. On the other hand, it was a kind of an honest thing to do, because the basis for it was that AusAid wasn't meant to be, according to the Abbott government and the succeeding governments, wasn't meant to be a purely humanitarian exercise at all. It was meant to further Australia's interests. And of course, that's what it always did anyway. So in a sense, it was a statement of the truth, but of course, there's been a lot of loss in addition to that. When the United States sends corn to Uganda, they don't do it because they're worried about malnutrition in Uganda and they want to support the diets of children and so on. They do it because they want to protect American producers of corn. They want to subsidise the local producers, but they also want to prevent competition developing in other areas. So this is the same dynamic, exactly the same dynamic that Rob was talking about in relation to the activities of big companies. The US State Department, the Australian government, is just another big company which serves another set of interests that, as it happens, funnily enough, are closely aligned to the interests of the big corporations. So that's the tragedy of a lot of foreign and humanitarian aid. I want to just make a slight disclaimer here. I'm not criticising all humanitarian aid, and clearly it serves a critically important role, particularly in disaster response and disaster relief, although even in those circumstances, the conditions and the outcomes might be very complicated. I'm happy to tell you a little bit about that, particularly in relation to my experiences in post-tsunami Aceh, where the outcomes, in a sense, have been somewhat the opposite of what people imagined that they would be. Nonetheless, the the regimes of foreign aid are largely about large countries through their national agencies controlling the agendas of poor developing countries. They're highly centralised operations, highly bureaucratised. They generally support wealthy people, or they build a class within the countries that they support. They sustain and perpetuate hierarchy. They breed corruption, and in many cases very little of the aid actually gets through to the community level. And Palestine is an absolute typical case of all of this. 3/4 of the Palestinian economy is actually constituted by a gift. 3/4 of the GDP of Palestine is a gift from the rest of the world, mostly from Northern Europe, and all those things I just said before about maintaining hierarchy, breeding corruption, and so on are absolutely true. So this is the same pernicious dynamic that occurs within the tobacco industry, inscribed into areas that we take for granted are benevolent and altruistic and so on, like foreign aid. It's disappointing to hear that, I'm sure, for everyone. Health issues can't be seen in isolation. They can't be addressed purely at the level of technical interventions, for example, by pharmaceutical treatments. They have to take into account broader social, cultural and economic questions. And look, when you think about this, this is obvious, and I'm sure it comes naturally to you from your particular perspectives in relation to integrative medicine. A large part of so one of the areas in which I also have an interest is Swaziland. I have a PhD student who's spent many years working in Swaziland, which is a country that has the highest rate of HIV in the world. And there's been billions of dollars of aid that have been like airdropped into Swaziland, including antiretroviral drugs and so on. And it's made very little difference on the ground to either the incidence or the prevalence rather of HIV, or to the experiences of ordinary people. And that's because it's not just about pharmaceuticals. It's about the culture, it's about the dictatorship, it's about the effects of colonialism, it's about a whole lot of other things. So we can't work in just a monocausal manner by throwing money, throwing aid, throwing pharmaceuticals, but we've got to work with the local communities to build their capacity to identify what the major obstacles and problems are and to help them work their way through it. I'll just mention, the point about NGOs is that NGOs are good, non-government organisations are good, but they also often come with a price. Often NGOs can be organisations that arise within our own society, and people, again, none of what I'm saying suggests that the individuals involved in these activities are in any way at fault themselves. They're wonderful people and often put themselves at very great risk. In fact, there's a very big literature on how aid workers are often deeply traumatised by terrible things that they see. So, you know, the people who actually go on the ground are good people and do good things. It's the system and the regime that's the problem. NGOs can do good things, but it's also a very disparate, uncoordinated system. Often they have their own agendas, sometimes they're religious agendas that are at odds with the local cultures. And I'm just mentioning this other issue of so-called voluntourism, which is all the rage at the moment amongst medical students. Every medical student wants to go and do some sort of deployment in a developing country, and it's assumed that they're going there to do good in some way or another. We now know that in fact that untrained or semi-trained individuals going for short periods of time to do work that they're not trained to do may actually do more harm than good. and there's a lot of evidence in relation to this. And in fact, voluntourism has now become a very profitable industry. So it's been taken over by commercialising forces and so on, so that people pay to have a voluntour adventure in Nepal or whatever, and they go and they spend a little bit of time doing some charitable work and then go and have a holiday as well, and feel good about it. And look, they mean to do good, but the trouble is that the systems are more complicated than that. And as I say, untrained people going and displacing the local populations, depleting or undermining their skills or the development of skills can actually do a lot of harm. So these are very complicated issues. What sounds like a good idea, foreign aid and humanitarian aid, comes with a price, and the price ultimately might be not worth paying. So I'm going to tell you now in the second last part of my talk a little bit about Aid Exchange. Aid Exchange is a project that I've been working on with other people to build a platform for cross-border partnerships and support. And the idea of Aid Exchange is to kind of reverse this tendency, but to find ways in which communities can actually work together, to cut through all that huge bureaucracy, to avoid the corruption, to avoid the perpetuation of hierarchy, and actually put communities in direct contact with each other. And the way we're seeking to do it, and it's a project that we've spent a lot of time on, and it's not yet at fruition, and it's much more complicated than it sounds. But the idea is a simple one, and that is to use the current technologies that are available to enable people within civil society groups across borders actually to make direct contact with each other. And the idea is to use the model of the shared economy, of Airbnb, to create, in a word, a kind of humanitarian version of Airbnb, where instead of having the huge hotel industry and so on, which runs a monopoly that's owned by Philip Morris or whatever, actually to work within, to be able to put people who have things to offer and needs in direct contact with each other. Airbnb, Uber, Alibaba, eBay, those sorts of things. These are highly commercialised companies, of course, and they make huge amounts of money. That's not what we're aiming to do, of course. But the idea is to use the same concept of actually putting people in direct contact and cutting out all that bureaucracy so that people can actually form joint projects and support and work with each other directly. So we've spent a lot of time doing it. The program needs a lot of development, and it's difficult. It's aidexchange.org. This is the Mostar Bridge in Bosnia, which united two communities, which then were very disrupted by the conflict in 1992 to 1995, and the bridge has since been rebuilt as a symbol of reconciliation in that way. The idea of Aid Exchange is to enable people to log in, to come together, to have conversations, and to develop projects, joint projects across borders. Here's some examples of the projects that already feature on this site. Some of them are in the various countries that I've mentioned in the Middle East, in Myanmar, Sri Lanka, India, and so on. The idea is that people in Australia might have something to offer, and you can do a lot over the internet. You can share, particularly in educational areas, in health, in the arts, and so on. There's a lot of communication, a lot of contact that can occur, in which you can support activities in certain areas. And I'm going to talk about Gaza in a moment, where it's pretty hard actually to penetrate the border physically, but it's very easy, on the other hand, to establish a direct connection with civil society groups in Gaza. So I'm going to talk a project in Israel and Palestine is called Caring for Children, the Children of Israel and Palestine. And because of the time, I'm not going to go through the introductory details, but you can imagine for yourself what I'm about to say or what the premise of this is. There is an emergency in child health in the region, not just in Palestine, but in Israel as well. These are countries that live at the point of a gun. Everyone's at the point of a gun, and the consequences for the people, especially for the children, on all sides are devastating. Nothing that I'm saying is pointing the blame at any particular person or individual. Everyone suffers in a situation like this, and what we need is a process of reconciliation, a process to be able to bring people together so they can start to work together in a safe and cooperative way to build a new vision of how they can actually live together in peace and in such a way that they can support the members of their society, especially the children. I won't give you the facts because you can imagine them for yourself, but I will show you a few pictures. Gaza was a very beautiful place. In fact, it's a holiday venue, gorgeous pictures, and the people of Gaza are extremely friendly, gracious, hospitable. Gaza, as everyone here may know, has been part of the epicentre of the conflict in Israel and Palestine, and it's been controlled since 2007 by an Islamist group called Hamas, which has been rejected as a terrorist organisation by many countries in the world, including Australia. Hamas, whatever you think of it, has been completely incompetent in actually governing the country. It's been a total disaster for Gaza. The point of saying that is not to point the finger at anyone in particular, but to tell you something that probably is unexpected, and that is that in Gaza, it's kind of I said Myanmar was ground zero as far as healthcare. Gaza's kind of ground zero as far as governance is concerned, partly because of the blockade, partly because of the 4 wars that they've fought since 2008, and partly because of the incompetence of the local authorities. As a result of which, there has been a flowering of local community organisations. I've never been in a situation where there have been so many civil society organisations as in Gaza, and that they will be for child support, for women's health, to care for elderly people and so on. So this is a society in which there's almost nothing in terms of large-scale social welfare, as a result of which the people have done it themselves. They've formed themselves into little groups, and many of these groups are now seeking help and assistance outside their borders. This is 4 children, and the foreshore, as you can see, up in the left, there's a police car keeping watch on me. I took a picture of this bliss life. It's sort of a little bit... this is a man standing outside his house. There've been 4, if you're 8 in Gaza today, you've lived through 4 wars. And everyone's got a traumatic story to tell. If you go into a school and you ask children to draw pictures, they will draw pictures of... sorry, I thought I had a picture of what these kids were drawing. It's dismembered bodies and bombs coming from the air and so on. This is what children see when they close their eyes in the night. This is just an example of one of the many of these organisations called the Culture and Free Thought Association, which was set up by 4 feminist women in the early 90s. This woman on the left's a young woman called Nabila. Neither of these are the founders. I can show you pictures of those. And it's a self-help organisation which they set up in order to provide assistance for children as an after-schools program. It now runs health programs, women's health and so on. This is a science lab that they have where they teach teach kids how to do make devices that are valuable for the local community. Like this is an automatic watering device so they can grow food. This is a domestic violence dramatic piece that they put on. And just to finish, this is Ahmed, a 16-year-old artist whose pictures are around him, and these are a couple of examples of the vision of a 16-year-old in Gaza. My purpose in talking about Gaza in the context of this talk, and I'll just summarise as I finish now, this is the end, my purpose is to draw attention to the need for other ways of working. Rob talked about the corporatisation of the tobacco industry and the pernicious manner in which it operates. I'm saying this is on a very large scale, and even things that we take for granted, like foreign aid and humanitarian aid, actually work within a very similar sort of paradigm. What we need to do is to get back to the grassroots. We need to find ways ourselves to be able to make contact with people who are suffering, who are trying to do the right thing, who are outside of the political mainstream, like the people I've just shown you. And there are ways in which we can do so. So we have the power, we have the mechanisms, we have the technologies in order to be able to do the things that we thought we were doing or wanted to do all along. I think I'll end there. Thanks.